Hello everyone, and welcome back to another video from Gone Legends. In today's video, we'll be highlighting American celebrities who passed away today, and in recent days, along with other notable individuals from around the world. Before we proceed, we kindly ask for your support. If you find these tributes meaningful, please take a moment to like this video. It truly means a lot to us. Thank you for being here. And now, let's begin. 1.
Ron Kenoly. The moment the music finally fell silent marked the end of a remarkable life. On February 3, 2006, Ron Kenoly passed away at the age of 81. He died peacefully after a period of declining health related to age, surrounded by loved ones, closing a life devoted almost entirely to faith, worship, and spiritual unity. News of his passing spread quietly through churches, worship halls, and faith communities across the world, bringing not shock, but a deep and reverent sadness. Born in 1944 in the United States, Ron Kenoly lived as an American gospel singer, worship leader, and pastor whose voice became one of the most recognizable sounds in modern Christian worship. His early life was shaped by faith and church music, where devotion mattered more than recognition. He rose slowly and patiently, leading worship long before global stages ever appeared. When his music reached international audiences in the 1990s, it carried joy rather than ego, praise rather than performance. His songs filled churches across continents, transforming worship into celebration and unity. Ron Kenoly's legacy continues in every voice lifted in praise, and every gathering where music becomes prayer, reminding the world that faith, when shared sincerely, can move millions without demanding applause.
2.
Alan Massey. The quiet finality of February 3, 2026, marked the passing of Alan Massey at the age of 87. He died following complications related to age, closing the final chapter of a long, thoughtful, and influential life. His death signaled the loss of one of Britain's most respected literary and journalistic voices. Born in 1938 in Scotland, Alan Massey lived in the United Kingdom and became known as a journalist, novelist, and historian whose words carried clarity and depth. News of his passing was felt deeply by readers who had followed his work for decades, trusting his ability to explore power, politics, and history with honesty and restraint. His early life was shaped by education and a deep fascination with history and human ambition. He rose through journalism with discipline, choosing substance over spectacle, earning respect rather than chasing attention. His novels reimagined historical figures as complex, flawed, and deeply human. Alan Massey's legacy remains in his writing, in stories that continue to speak long after his voice is gone, proving that truth written with care never fades.
3.
John Virgo. On February 4, 2026, John Virgo passed away at the age of 79 after a period of illness, leaving behind a silence deeply felt in the world of snooker. His death marked the loss of a figure whose presence shaped both competition and commentary for generations. Born in 1946 in England, John Virgo lived as an English snooker champion and broadcaster whose voice became inseparable from the sport itself. His early life was defined by discipline and an obsession with precision, spending countless hours mastering control and focus. Rising through competitive ranks, he reached the pinnacle of success as the 1979 youth champion. Yet his greatest influence came after his playing career ended, when his commentary transformed how the game was experienced. His voice turned tension into theater and silence into anticipation. John Virgo's legacy lives on in the sound of snooker, forever echoing through its most unforgettable moments.
4.
Miguel Angel Alba Diaz. On February 2, 2026, Miguel Angel Alba Diaz passed away at the age of 75 after suffering health complications related to prolonged illness. His death marked the quiet departure of a spiritual leader whose life had been devoted to service, guidance, and faith. News of his passing spread gently through religious communities in Mexico, bringing sorrow not filled with noise, but with prayer. Born in 1950 in Mexico, Miguel Angel Alba Diaz lived as a Mexican Catholic bishop known for humility rather than authority. His early life was shaped by a calling to serve, choosing a path of faith over personal ambition. Through years of dedication, he rose within the church and became Bishop of La Paz in Baja California Sur, where he focused on pastoral care rather than prominence. He was known for listening more than speaking, for presence more than position. His leadership emphasized compassion, community, and spiritual strength during difficult times. Miguel Ángel Alba Diaz's legacy lives on in the people he guided, the faith he strengthened, and the quiet reminder that true leadership is measured by service, not status.
5.
Myra Macpherson on February 2, 2026. Myra Macpherson passed away at the age of 91 after a long life marked by courage, conviction, and relentless pursuit of truth. Her death marked the loss of a powerful voice in American journalism. Born in 1934 in the United States, Myra Macpherson lived as an American journalist and author whose work challenged injustice and amplified voices often ignored. News of her passing resonated deeply among readers, activists, and fellow journalists who understood the weight of her contributions. Her early career unfolded in newsrooms dominated by resistance to change, yet she persisted with clarity and determination. She reported on politics, women's rights, and social inequality with fearless honesty. Her books documented the struggles and achievements of women navigating power, shaping public awareness and dialogue. Myra Macpherson's legacy endures in journalism that refuses silence, reminding future generations that truth must be defended, even when it is uncomfortable.
6.
Bud Moore on February 2, 2026. Bud Moore passed away at the age of 86 due to complications related to age. His death marked the loss of a respected figure in American college football, remembered as both a leader and mentor. Born in 1939 in the United States, Bud Moore lived as an American football player and coach whose influence reached far beyond the scoreboard. His early life was shaped by discipline, teamwork, and a deep love for the game. Rising through coaching ranks, he became head coach at the University of Arizona, where he led the program through historic seasons and cultural change. Known for integrity and leadership, he focused on building character as much as winning games. Players remembered him not only for strategies but for lessons that lasted long after their final season. Bud Moore's legacy lives on in the athletes he guided and the belief that true success in sports is measured by character.
7.
Chuck Negron on February 2, 2006. Chuck Negron passed away at the age of 83 after ongoing health struggles. His death marked the end of a powerful and turbulent chapter in American music history. Born in 1942 in the United States, Chuck Negron lived as an American singer, best known as the lead vocalist of the band, Three Dog Night. News of his passing stirred memories of an era defined by unforgettable melodies and raw emotion. His early life revealed extraordinary vocal talent, propelling him into sudden fame during the late 1960s and 1970s. Songs like Joy to the World and One became timeless anthems. Yet behind success lived personal struggle, including addiction and hardship. Through recovery and honesty, he transformed pain into survival and reflection. Chuck Negron's legacy remains in music that continues to resonate across generations, reminding the world that even imperfect lives can create something lasting and beautiful.
8.
Angelina Jolie was born on June 4, 1975, in Los Angeles, California, United States, into a world already touched by fame, expectation, and quiet fractures. From the very beginning, her life carried the weight of a legacy and the shadow of complexity. She was born Angelina Jolie Vogt, the daughter of Academy Award-winning actor Jon Voight and actress Marshalline Bertrand, a woman whose gentleness and inner strength would become the emotional compass of Angelina's life. Though she entered the world surrounded by the glow of Hollywood, her childhood was not shaped by glamour but by emotional distance, instability, and a deep longing for connection. Angelina's parents separated when she was still an infant, and her mother chose to step away from her own acting career to raise Angelina and her brother James Haven. That decision shaped Angelina profoundly. She grew up watching sacrifice firsthand, learning early that love often demands invisibility. Raised primarily in Los Angeles, she spent parts of her childhood in New York as well, drifting between cities and identities, never fully belonging, always observing. Her relationship with her father grew strained over time, leaving a silence that would echo through her adolescence and adulthood. From a young age, Angelina was introspective, intense, and emotionally perceptive. She did not blend easily into the world around her. At school, she often felt isolated, describing herself later as feeling different and disconnected. She struggled with self-esteem and identity, experiencing periods of deep emotional pain that would later become part of her public truth. Acting, however, became her refuge. It was not a pursuit of fame, but an escape, a place where emotion could be expressed rather than suppressed. She studied at the Lee Strasberg Theatre Institute, immersing herself in method acting, learning to draw from inner experience rather than surface performance. Her early work was raw and unpolished, but undeniably authentic. In the early 1990s, she appeared in music videos and low-budget films, roles that hinted at intensity rather than stardom. Angelina did not arrive quietly. She arrived carrying emotion that could not be ignored. Her breakthrough came in 1998 with the television film Gia, where she portrayed supermodel Gia Karanji. The role demanded vulnerability, darkness, and fearlessness, and Angelina delivered all three with devastating honesty. Her performance was not simply acting, it was exposure. The film explored addiction, loneliness, and self-destruction, themes that mirrored struggles Angelina herself would later speak openly about. Her portrayal earned her a Golden Globe Award and critical acclaim, signaling the arrival of a talent unlike any Hollywood had seen in years. Hollywood began to notice not just her beauty, but her gravity. In 1999, she starred in Girl, Interrupted, a performance that would define her early career. Playing Lisa Rowe, a rebellious and volatile psychiatric patient, Angelina dominated the screen with unsettling charisma. Her performance earned her the Academy Award for Best Supporting Actress. But more importantly, it shattered any remaining doubts about her depth as an artist. She was no longer a rising star. She was a force. Yet fame did not bring peace. As her career soared, Angelina's personal life became increasingly turbulent. She was open about her struggles with mental health, self-harm, and emotional instability. Unlike many celebrities, she did not hide behind silence. She spoke openly, honestly, and without apology. In doing so, she unknowingly became a voice for countless people who felt unseen. The early 2000s transformed Angelina Jolie into a global icon. Films like Lara Croft, Tomb Raider turned her into an action star, redefining what female strength looked like on screen. She was athletic, commanding, and unapologetically powerful. The world saw confidence, but beneath it lived a woman still searching for meaning beyond fame. That search would take her far from Hollywood. In 2001, while filming Lara Croft in Cambodia, Angelina encountered poverty and human suffering on a scale she had never known. That experience altered the course of her life. She described it as an awakening, a moment when fame felt irrelevant in the face of real human pain. She began working with the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, eventually becoming a goodwill ambassador. This was not a temporary gesture. It was the beginning of a lifelong commitment. Angelina Jolie did not just visit refugee camps. She listened, she learned. She returned again and again, traveling to some of the world's most dangerous regions: Sierra Leone, Afghanistan, Sudan, often away from cameras, often without public announcement. Over time, she transformed from actress to advocate, from observer to participant. Her humanitarian work grew alongside her career, not as a side project, but as a parallel purpose. At the same time, her personal life continued to evolve under intense public scrutiny. Her marriages, relationships, and motherhood became global headlines, often reducing her complexity to spectacle. But behind the noise, Angelina was building something deeply personal, a family defined not by biology alone, but by choice and compassion. She adopted children from different parts of the world, embracing motherhood as both responsibility and redemption. Angelina Jolie's legacy cannot be contained within filmography or awards. She is an artist shaped by pain, a survivor who chose visibility over silence, a public figure who transformed privilege into purpose. Her life is not a straight line. It is a constellation of contradictions, strength and vulnerability, fame and humility, chaos and discipline. And this is only the beginning. As Angelina Jolie moved deeper into adulthood, her life began to stretch far beyond the boundaries of cinema. Fame had already given her access to the world, but it was conscience that began to guide where she went next. What started as curiosity during a film shoot slowly transformed into a lifelong responsibility, one that would redefine how the world understood her and how she understood herself. Her humanitarian journey was not symbolic, it was immersive, often uncomfortable, and deeply personal. After witnessing the realities of displacement and war in Cambodia, Angelina Jolie committed herself to understanding the systems that created suffering rather than simply reacting to the symptoms. In 2001, she was officially appointed as a Goodwill Ambassador for the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. It was a role she accepted not with ceremony, but with seriousness. She traveled to refugee camps across the globe, standing face to face with families who had lost everything: homes, safety, identity. In Sierra Leone, she listened to stories of civil war and child soldiers. In Afghanistan, she walked through ruins left behind by decades of conflict. In Sudan and Iraq, she bore witness to displacement so vast it felt unimaginable. These journeys were not staged. Many were undertaken quietly, away from red carpets and interviews. Over time, her presence in these regions became consistent enough that she was no longer seen as a visiting celebrity, but as a committed advocate. Her work with the unevolved. In 2012, Angelina Jolie was named Special Envoy to the UNHCR, a position that carried greater responsibility and influence. She used her platform to speak directly to world leaders, governments, and international organizations, addressing refugee rights, sexual violence in conflict zones, and the long-term consequences of war. Her speeches were measured, informed, and grounded in lived observation. She did not speak in abstractions. She spoke in names, places, and stories. Parallel to this global advocacy, Angelina's personal life continued to unfold in ways that were deeply scrutinized and often misunderstood. Motherhood became one of the most defining chapters of her life. She adopted her first child, Maddox, from Cambodia in 2002. That decision was not framed by impulse, but by connection. Over time, her family grew to include children from Ethiopia and Vietnam, as well as biological children. Each adoption reflected her belief that family could be expansive, inclusive, and intentional. Motherhood softened and strengthened her simultaneously. She spoke openly about how her children grounded her, giving her a sense of purpose that fame never could. Raising children from different cultural backgrounds requires constant learning, respect, and humility. She did not present motherhood as effortless. Instead, she described it as transformative, demanding, and deeply instructive. Her relationship with actor Brad Pitt brought global attention that often overshadowed her work. For years, their partnership dominated headlines, reducing complex individuals into tabloid narratives. Yet behind the spectacle was a family navigating life under relentless observation. Their eventual separation and divorce became one of the most public breakups in modern celebrity culture, accompanied by legal battles and painful revelations. Throughout this period, Angelina Jolie remained deliberate in her public responses. She spoke cautiously, prioritizing her children's privacy over public vindication. Her restraint, in contrast to the noise surrounding her, revealed a woman shaped by experience rather than reaction. Professionally, Angelina began to shift away from acting alone. She moved behind the camera, directing and producing films that explored war, trauma, and survival. Her directorial debut in The Land of Blood and Honey focused on the Bosnian War, portraying sexual violence not as shock but as a consequence. The film was divisive, but it was honest. She followed with Unbroken, telling the story of Olympic athlete and war survivor Louis Zamperini, emphasizing endurance rather than heroism. These projects reflected her evolving identity not just as an entertainer, but as a storyteller committed to difficult truths. She did not choose subjects for comfort. She chose them for relevance. Angelina Jolie's physical health also became part of her public narrative in a way that shifted global conversations. In 2013, she revealed that she carried a BRCA1 gene mutation that significantly increased her risk of breast and ovarian cancer. She chose to undergo a preventive double mastectomy, later followed by additional surgeries. Her decision to share this openly was not about sympathy. It was about information. It sparked worldwide discussion about genetic testing, women's health, and proactive medical care. Once again, Angelina transformed vulnerability into awareness. She used her personal decision to empower others, reminding the world that strength often involves difficult, private choices made for long-term survival. Through all of this advocacy, motherhood, health battles, and creative reinvention, Angelina Jolie remained a figure of contradiction and cohesion. She was both global and intimate, public and guarded, fierce and reflective. Her life did not follow a single arc, but multiple intersecting paths, each informed by pain, compassion, and intention. And still, her journey continued. As the years moved forward, Angelina Jolie entered a phase of life defined less by arrival and more by intention. The world already knew her face, her voice, her past. What began to matter now was how she chose to use everything she had become. Fame no longer chased her. Instead, she directed it, reshaped it, and at times deliberately stepped away from it. Her acting career evolved with the same quiet deliberation that had come to define her personal choices. She no longer pursued roles for visibility alone. Each performance became selective, purposeful. Films like Changeling revealed a restrained, emotionally grounded performance, portraying grief not as spectacle but as endurance. Her work carried maturity, patience, and lived understanding. She no longer needed to prove intensity. It existed naturally within her. At the same time, her presence behind the camera deepened. Directing was no longer an experiment, it became a responsibility. With First, They Killed My Father, a film based on the Cambodian genocide, Angelina returned to the country that had first awakened her humanitarian conscience. The project was deeply personal. It was not told through a Western lens, nor designed for comfort. It was told through the eyes of a child, reflecting loss, resilience, and memory. For Angelina, this film was a form of tribute to the people who had shaped her worldview and to the children whose stories too often remain unheard. Her work increasingly blurred the line between art and advocacy. She did not separate storytelling from responsibility. For her, cinema was not only entertainment, it was a witness. As a public figure, Angelina Jolie became something rare in modern celebrity culture, a woman allowed to change. She was no longer defined solely by youth, rebellion, or tabloid mythology. She was evolving openly, refusing to be frozen in any single version of herself. She spoke less but with more weight. When she did speak, it was often about displacement, women's rights, education, and the cost of global indifference. Her influence extended into diplomacy and law. She studied international relations, worked with legal experts, and contributed to global initiatives addressing sexual violence in conflict zones. She co-founded programs aimed at accountability and prevention, emphasizing justice rather than charity. Her advocacy was informed, persistent, and increasingly structural. She understood that awareness without action was not enough. Motherhood remained the emotional center of her life. As her children grew older, Angelina spoke about raising them with cultural awareness, responsibility, and empathy. She emphasized listening to their identities rather than shaping them in her image. Her parenting was not about control, but guidance. She described her children as her greatest teachers, grounding her in reality when the world attempted to project myth onto her. The public perception of Angelina Jolie shifted again during this period. Where once she had been framed as controversial or extreme, she came to be viewed with respect, even quiet reverence, not because she demanded it, but because time revealed consistency. She did not abandon causes when trends changed. She did not retreat when advocacy became uncomfortable. She stayed. Angelina Jolie's legacy is not singular. It does not belong solely to Hollywood, nor to humanitarian corridors, nor to red carpets or refugee camps. It exists in the space between visibility and humility. She redefined what it means to be powerful without being loud, influential without being distant, vulnerable without being weak. She challenged the idea that celebrities must remain static, that pain must be hidden, or that compassion must be performative. Instead, she demonstrated that a public life could still be deeply private, that fame could be redirected toward purpose, and that reinvention is not betrayal, it is growth. Angelina Jolie's life is still unfolding. She is not a legend because her journey has ended, but because she chose to live it openly, imperfectly, and with intention. Her story is one of survival, responsibility, and evolution, a reminder that legacy is not built in moments of applause, but in years of consistent choice. And in the quiet spaces between headlines and history, her impact continues to ripple outward, touching lives far beyond the screen. As time continued its quiet march forward, Angelina Jolie's presence in the world settled into something deeper than fame and broader than influence. She became less of a headline and more of a constant figure whose relevance did not depend on trends, box office numbers, or public approval. By this stage of her life, she had already lived several lifetimes within one: the troubled youth, the Hollywood icon, the global humanitarian, the mother, the survivor, the advocate. What remained was integration, the weaving together of everything she had been into something whole. Her later years were marked by a conscious shift toward sustainability rather than spectacle. Angelina Jolie became increasingly selective about where she appeared and why. When she stepped onto global stages, it was often in rooms far removed from cameras, meetings with policymakers, discussions with educators, conversations with displaced families whose names would never trend. She understood that real change rarely announces itself loudly. It happens slowly, through persistence, through presence, through listening. Her work in international law and human rights grew more sophisticated. She collaborated with experts to address war crimes, sexual violence, and accountability, particularly in regions where justice systems had collapsed under conflict. She emphasized prevention over reaction, education over sympathy. Her advocacy focused on restoring dignity rather than assigning pity. For Angelina Jolie, humanitarianism was not about saving others, it was about standing beside them. In cinema, her influence endured even as her appearances became rarer. Younger generations of filmmakers and actors cited her not just as inspiration, but as proof that a career could be expansive and ethical at the same time. She had shown that one could step away from the spotlight without disappearing, that relevance could be measured in impact rather than visibility. Her earlier roles continued to be studied for their emotional fearlessness, while her later projects were admired for restraint and purpose. Angelina Jolie's legacy within popular culture is inseparable from her refusal to conform. She challenged expectations placed on women in every phase of life. She rejected the idea that beauty must be silent, that motherhood must be limiting, that vulnerability must be hidden. By sharing her struggles with mental health, identity, and physical illness, she reshaped conversations that had long been surrounded by shame. Her openness did not diminish her authority, it strengthened it. As her children matured, her role as a mother evolved into one of guidance rather than protection. She spoke of preparing them not for fame, but for responsibility. She encouraged curiosity, cultural respect, and independence. In doing so, she extended her values beyond herself, planting them into the future through the next generation. Her family became not a symbol, but a continuation of her belief that the world is interconnected and that empathy begins at home. Public perception, once volatile and polarized, gradually softened into understanding. Time revealed patterns that headlines could not. Angelina Jolie had been consistent where others were performative, patient where others were reactive. She did not chase redemption arcs, she lived them quietly. Her life became a reminder that growth does not require erasing the past, it requires learning from it. When history looks back, Angelina Jolie will not be defined by a single role, relationship, or controversy. She will be remembered as a woman who refused to remain static in a world that prefers simple narratives. She expanded the meaning of celebrity into responsibility, transformed personal pain into collective awareness, and demonstrated that influence carries moral weight. Her story is not one of perfection. It is one of choice, repeated, difficult, intentional choice. To speak when silence was easier, to act when observation was safer, to change when staying the same would have been more comfortable. Angelina Jolie stands as a living example of how a public life can still be deeply human. Her journey reminds us that legacy is not built in moments of triumph alone, but in years of alignment between values and action. And as her life continues forward, it does so not as a performance, but as a presence, quiet, enduring, and profoundly influential. As the years accumulated, Angelina Jolie entered a stage of life defined not by reinvention, but by reflection. This was not a slowing down, but a deepening. The urgency that once marked her early adulthood transformed into something steadier, more deliberate. She no longer needed to announce who she was becoming. Her actions spoke quietly, consistently, and with purpose. Her relationship with the public evolved into one of distance without disconnection. She did not retreat from the world, but she chose how the world reached her. Interviews became rare and intentional. When she spoke, it was often about systems rather than herself, about collective responsibility rather than personal narrative. She resisted the temptation to center her own story, even though the world continued to ask for it. This restraint became part of her power. Angelina Jolie's influence within global humanitarian circles matured into something close to institutional memory. She was no longer the actress who cared, but a figure whose years of presence granted her credibility. She understood policy language, legal frameworks, and the complexities of international response. She challenged superficial solutions and pushed for long-term commitments. In private meetings, she asked difficult questions. In public forums, she spoke with restraint and clarity, refusing exaggeration even when it would have amplified attention. Her advocacy for refugees and displaced persons remained at the core of her work. She continued to emphasize education, particularly for girls, as the foundation of long-term stability. She spoke often about the invisible aftermath of war, the trauma that lingers long after violence ends, the children who grow up knowing only instability. Her concern was not only with survival but with dignity. She reminded the world that being safe is not the same as being seen. Creatively, Angelina Jolie's relationship with storytelling became more internal. She showed increasing interest in narratives that preserved memory stories that resisted erasure. Whether through film, writing, or collaboration, she sought to document experiences that history often compresses or forgets. She believed deeply that storytelling could be an act of justice, a way to return voice to those stripped of it. Her earlier image as a symbol of rebellion gradually gave way to something more complex, a woman who had learned to live with contradiction. She did not deny her past. She contextualized it. She spoke about pain without romanticizing it, about survival without glorifying suffering. This honesty resonated most strongly with those who had grown alongside her, who recognized themselves in her evolution. Angelina Jolie's health journey continued to inform her public philosophy. Having faced mortality not as an abstraction but as a probability, she approached life with heightened awareness. She advocated for preventive care, informed decision-making, and bodily autonomy, particularly for women. She reframed strength as preparation, courage as foresight. In doing so, she expanded the conversation around health beyond fear and into empowerment. Her children, now growing into their own identities, remained central to her sense of meaning. She spoke of letting go, of trusting the values she had tried to instill. Parenthood, for her, was never about possession, but stewardship. She believed children should outgrow their parents' shadows, not live within them. This belief guided her as she gradually stepped back, allowing space for their independence. Culturally, Angelina Jolie's legacy continued to solidify. Younger generations encountered her not first through tabloid stories, but through her body of work and impact. She became a reference point rather than a curiosity. Scholars discussed her influence on representations of women in cinema. Advocates cited her role in mainstreaming humanitarian discourse. She had crossed a threshold from celebrity to case study, from figure to framework. What defines Angelina Jolie at this stage is coherence. The pieces of her life that once seemed contradictory, fame and humility, intensity and restraint, vulnerability and authority, began to align. She did not resolve the complexity by simplifying herself. She lived with it. Her life demonstrates that meaning is not discovered once but repeatedly chosen, that growth is not linear, that influence, when carried responsibly, can outlast noise. Angelina Jolie's journey stands as a testament to the idea that public lives can still be ethical lives. It continues in classrooms, in refugee camps, in conversations about health and dignity, in films that dare to remember, and in the quiet courage of those who saw her choose purpose and found permission to choose it themselves. As Angelina Jolie moved further into the later chapters of her life, something remarkable became increasingly clear. She was no longer defined by reaction. The chaos, intensity, and urgency that once surrounded her had gradually given way to intention and stillness. This was not the stillness of withdrawal, but the calm of someone who had learned where her energy truly mattered. She had reached a point where she no longer needed to prove her depth, her strength, or her relevance. She lived them. Her relationship with fame had transformed into something almost philosophical. Angelina understood celebrity as a temporary condition, not an identity. She watched generations of public figures rise and fall in cycles driven by speed and spectacle, and she chose a different rhythm. When she appeared, it was deliberate. When she spoke, it was measured. When she worked, it was rooted in long-term consequences rather than immediate applause. In an era of constant exposure, her restraint became a statement. Her humanitarian efforts continued quietly but powerfully. She remained deeply involved with global displacement issues, often focusing on regions that had slipped from public attention. Conflicts no longer trending still mattered to her. Refugees no longer in headlines still deserved protection. She advocated for legal frameworks that treated displaced people not as burdens, but as human beings with rights, skills, and futures. Her approach was pragmatic as much as compassionate. She pushed for education access, legal documentation, and economic inclusion, understanding that survival alone was not enough. Angelina Jolie's work increasingly emphasized prevention, preventing violence, preventing exploitation, preventing the generational repetition of trauma. She spoke about early intervention, about addressing inequality before it erupted into crisis. Her advocacy matured into systems thinking, a recognition that compassion must be supported by structure if it is to last. This perspective set her apart. She was not reacting to suffering. She was trying to reduce its inevitability. Creatively, her voice became quieter but sharper. When she returned to storytelling, it was with a sense of preservation. She gravitated towards stories that carried historical weight, cultural memory, and moral consequence. She believed deeply that forgetting was a form of injustice. Her work reflected a desire to archive human experience honestly, without simplification or sentimentality. These were not stories designed to comfort. They were stories designed to endure. Her influence on women in public life continued to resonate profoundly. Angelina Jolie had dismantled countless stereotypes simply by refusing to conform to them. She showed that women could be fierce without being cruel, maternal without being diminished, emotional without being unstable, and powerful without being domineering. She lived publicly with complexity and refused to apologize for it. In doing so, she expanded what was possible for others. She also reshaped conversations around resilience. She rejected the idea that survival must look triumphant. Instead, she spoke about healing as nonlinear, ongoing, and deeply personal. She acknowledged that pain leaves residue, that strength can coexist with scars. This honesty allowed others to recognize themselves in her journey, not as inspiration to imitate, but as permission to be human. Angelina's personal philosophy increasingly centered on responsibility. She spoke about inherited privilege not as a guilt to perform, but as a resource to redistribute. She believed that access should be leveraged, not celebrated. This belief informed how she raised her children, how she approached work, and how she engaged with the world. She was not interested in being admired. She was interested in being useful. As her children stepped further into their own lives, Angelina embraced the quiet transition from protector to witness. She allowed them space to disagree, to question, to define themselves independently. She trusted that values, once lived authentically, did not need constant reinforcement. Parenthood, for her, had always been about preparing others to move beyond her reach. Culturally, Angelina Jolie had become something rare, a public figure whose relevance deepened with time. She was no longer a symbol of rebellion or controversy. She was a reference point for integrity, evolution, and ethical influence. Scholars, advocates, and artists alike looked to her career as evidence that longevity could be built on alignment rather than reinvention alone. Her life demonstrated that meaning is not found in extremes, but in consistency, that the loudest impact is not always the most visible, that choosing responsibility repeatedly, over decades, shapes a legacy far more durable than any single achievement. Angelina Jolie's journey continues not as a spectacle, but as a steady presence, one shaped by empathy, discipline, and moral clarity. She remains a reminder that a life lived in the public eye does not have to be performative, that growth does not require erasure, and that purpose, once chosen, can guide a person through every transformation that follows. And as her story moves forward, it does so not toward an ending, but toward continuation carried quietly in the lives she has touched, the systems she has challenged, and the enduring belief that influence, when guided by conscience, can still change the world. As Angelina Jolie moved deeper into this stage of her life, her journey began to feel less like a narrative with turning points, and more like a steady current, quiet, intentional, and enduring. She no longer occupied space to be seen, she occupied it to be useful. The urgency that once defined her public image had softened into something more sustainable, guided by patience rather than reaction. This was the shape of a life no longer proving itself, but living in alignment. Her role in global advocacy increasingly shifted toward mentorship and structural influence. She supported emerging voices in humanitarian work, particularly women and local leaders who understood their communities better than any outsider ever could. She believed deeply that progress required listening more than leading, amplifying rather than directing. In conversations about global crises, she redirected focus away from herself and toward those with lived experience, insisting that solutions must grow from within affected communities. Angelina Jolie's understanding of power became increasingly nuanced. She spoke about how attention can distort intention and how silence, when chosen carefully, can sometimes carry more weight than speech. She resisted the pressure to comment on every issue, choosing instead to act where she could contribute meaningfully. This discernment reflected maturity, a recognition that impact is diluted when spread too thin. In the creative world, her legacy continued to influence without domination. Filmmakers cited her not only for her performances, but for her insistence on authenticity and ethical storytelling. She challenged the industry to approach stories of trauma with care rather than exploitation, to portray suffering without stripping it of dignity. Her influence helped shift conversations about representation, authorship, and responsibility in global storytelling. Angelina's earlier openness about mental health, pain, and survival continued to resonate across generations. What once seemed radical had become foundational. She had helped normalize conversations that were once taboo, simply by refusing to hide. Her honesty offered others permission not to emulate her life, but to speak their own truths without shame. In this way, her impact extended far beyond her own experience. Her relationship with time itself appeared transformed. She spoke about urgency less and presence more, about choosing where to place energy and accepting what could not be changed. This philosophy shaped her daily life, her work, and her relationships. She understood that meaning was not something to chase, but something to practice. As the world continued to change rapidly, Angelina Jolie remained steady. She did not anchor herself to eras or identities. She adapted without losing coherence. She allowed herself to evolve publicly without demanding applause for it. This balance between visibility and restraint, conviction and humility became one of her most defining qualities. When people spoke of her now, they spoke not just of films or fame, but of example. Of a life that demonstrated how influence could mature rather than decay, how compassion could be disciplined rather than impulsive, how purpose, once chosen, could guide decades of decision-making. Angelina Jolie's story does not ask to be admired, it asks to be considered. It invites reflection on what it means to live with access and choose responsibility, to endure pain and choose meaning, to be seen and still remain grounded. Her journey suggests that a life well lived is not one without contradiction, but one willing to face it honestly. As this chapter unfolds, her legacy continues to expand quietly through institutions strengthened, conversations reshaped, stories preserved, and individuals empowered to act with empathy. She does not define herself by what she has accomplished, but by what she continues to protect and promote. And so, her path continues forward, not as a crescendo, but as a steady presence reminding the world that some legacies are not declared. They are lived, day after day, choice after choice, long after the spotlight has learned to move on. By this stage of her life, Angelina Jolie had become something that cannot be manufactured and cannot be rushed, a figure shaped by time. Not time measured in years alone, but time measured in consequence. Every choice she made now carried echoes of everything she had lived before. And she treated that weight not as a burden, but as a responsibility. Her presence in global conversations no longer depended on novelty. She was invited into rooms not because of who she once was, but because of what she consistently brought: clarity, preparation, and moral seriousness. When she spoke to policymakers, diplomats, and humanitarian leaders, she spoke as someone who had walked through camps, listened to survivors, and returned long after cameras had gone. Her credibility came from repetition, from showing up again and again when attention had moved elsewhere. Angelina Jolie increasingly emphasized the concept of agency. She rejected narratives that portrayed vulnerable populations as helpless or voiceless. In her speeches and writings, she insisted on centering refugees, survivors, and marginalized communities as active participants in their own futures. She challenged aid models that reinforced dependency and advocated for education, legal recognition, and local leadership. Her language was careful, intentional, and deeply informed. She understood that words shape policy, and policy shapes lives. Her influence extended quietly into academic and legal spaces. Universities studied her approach to humanitarian advocacy as a case in modern diplomacy. Law students examined initiatives she supported that addressed accountability for wartime sexual violence. She was no longer simply an advocate amplifying experts; she had become part of the intellectual framework shaping these discussions. This evolution did not harden her, it refined her. In popular culture, Angelina Jolie's earlier image continued to evolve. Younger audiences encountered her work without the baggage of earlier tabloid narratives. They saw a body of performances marked by fearlessness, a career that refused to be confined, and a public life that modeled ethical complexity. She became a figure people returned to, not for spectacle but for reference, someone whose journey illustrated that reinvention does not require abandonment of self. She also began speaking more openly about the cost of caring, not as discouragement but as honesty. She acknowledged burnout, emotional fatigue, and the toll of sustained exposure to human suffering. She spoke about the importance of rest, boundaries, and collective responsibility, reminding audiences that compassion cannot survive without care for oneself. This transparency added another dimension to her legacy, one rooted not in endurance alone, but in sustainability. Angelina Jolie's creative instincts continued to guide her toward preservation. She expressed growing interest in archiving stories, ensuring that testimonies of survival, displacement, and resistance were recorded with dignity. She believed memory was a form of justice, that forgetting, especially on a global scale, allowed harm to repeat. Her storytelling increasingly sought to resist erasure, to slow history down long enough for reflection. At a personal level, she embraced quietness more fully. This was not retreat, but balance. She allowed her life to contain spaces unshared, moments unspoken. In doing so, she reclaimed something rare for public figures: interiority. She lived with less explanation and more presence. Her choices reflected confidence not in how she was perceived, but in what she stood for. Her relationship with her children matured into a partnership rather than protection. She listened more than instructed. She trusted that values lived consistently did not require enforcement. Watching them grow into independent individuals reinforced her belief that influence is most powerful when it prepares others to move beyond it. Angelina Jolie's life, when viewed in totality, defies simplification. It is not a story of redemption or rebellion alone. It is a story of alignment between experience and action, pain and purpose, visibility and responsibility. She did not seek to be understood by everyone. She sought to be honest with herself. As her journey continued, she became less concerned with legacy as an idea and more concerned with impact as a practice. She believed legacy was not something to be claimed at the end of life, but something built quietly every day through decisions that align with conscience. Angelina Jolie stands as evidence that a public life can still be an examined life. That influence, when guided by humility and discipline, does not erode the soul. That transformation, when embraced rather than resisted, can become a form of service. And so her story moves forward not toward a conclusion, but toward continuation, carried in policies influenced, narratives preserved, children raised with empathy, and a global understanding that power, when paired with responsibility, can still be a force for good.